In the summer of 1969, a 4-year-old girl named Rose Avery was allowed to join a family friend on what was described as a short holiday trip to Scotland. It was not a stranger who came to the door, but a couple her parents had known for years. The plan was simple: a few days away, then a safe return. But she never came back. A child taken with permission had vanished completely. How does an ordinary trip, agreed to by everyone involved, turn into a disappearance that lasts more than 50 years? In the late months of 1969, the town of Ravenford in Yorkshire still carried the quiet rhythm of a working-class community that believed it understood its boundaries. It was a place where neighbors lingered at garden fences, where every child could name the families living along their street, and where trust wasn't earned through documents or formalities, but through years of familiar greetings and unspoken reliance. Life in that small town followed patterns that rarely broke. Men leaving early for the factories, women managing the home or part-time work, and children playing safely in the open without the fear that shadows might follow them. In such a world, it was difficult to imagine danger arriving without noise, without force, and without warning. The Avery family lived at the end of Millstone Road, in a narrow brick house that bore the marks of long hours and modest means, yet also the warmth of a home held together by affection and routine. Robert Avery worked at the metalworks plant, leaving before dawn most mornings, while his wife Elaine stitched garments in a local dress shop, balancing her income with the demands of raising 4 children. Their youngest, a 4-year-old girl named Rose, was known in the neighborhood for her soft voice and thoughtful gaze, the kind of child who preferred drawing circles on the pavement to chasing after the older children in loud games. She had a gentle manner that made people lean in to hear her speak, and a habit of clutching a small cloth rabbit that her mother had mended several times over the years. The family lived simply, but they lived closely, and in that closeness, they believed there was safety. During that period, the Avery household often crossed paths with the Reed couple, Malcolm and Charlotte, who had once lived 2 doors away before moving to a rented cottage on the edge of town. They were the kind of neighbors who arrived with a box of biscuits at Christmas and occasionally helped watch the children if Elaine's shift ran late. Nothing in their behavior suggested instability or threat. In fact, Charlotte in particular had a way of speaking to children that made them feel noticed, a trait that made her welcome at neighborhood gatherings and built a level of comfort that extended beyond the ordinary. That comfort, accumulated over familiar years, set the stage for what would later become an absence too large to reconcile. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, in the last week of September 1969, that Charlotte visited the Avery home without prior notice. She carried with her an air of enthusiasm, describing a short holiday she and her husband planned to take to Marlow Bay in Scotland, a place known at the time for its calm waters and quiet beaches. She suggested taking Rose along for a few days, explaining that the change of scenery would be good for the child, and that the Averys deserved a brief rest from the constant demands of parenting. For a family with limited means, the idea of their youngest experiencing something beyond the narrow streets of Ravenford felt like an unexpected gift, one they had little reason to refuse. Robert and Elaine exchanged the kind of hesitant glance that parents share when weighing opportunities against instinct, but the familiarity of the Reeds tipped the scale. They agreed. The following morning, Rose was dressed in her brown wool coat and given a small satchel containing a pair of socks, a comb, and the worn cloth rabbit that rarely left her hands. Elaine kissed her daughter's forehead, smoothing her dark hair before sending her off with the reassurance that she would be back soon with stories of the sea. Malcolm loaded their suitcase into a faded blue saloon car, and Charlotte helped Rose into the back seat, fastening her belt with practiced ease. The car rolled down Millstone Road, while neighbors waved from their windows, assuming that nothing about this scene warranted worry or suspicion. It was the kind of departure that blended so seamlessly into the town's ordinary routines that no one thought to remember the exact time or the way the sky looked that morning. There was only the quiet understanding that a child was going on holiday and would return shortly. Days passed, then a week, and then 2, and the absence that had first been accepted as part of the trip began to feel stretched and thin. Elaine phoned the small boarding house in Marlow Bay, where the Reeds said they would stay, but the owner reported no record of anyone by that name arriving. At first, Robert tried to offer explanations. Perhaps plans had changed, or perhaps the Reeds had chosen another stop along the coast. But even these attempts at reason could not hide the tension in his voice. The unease that had begun as a whisper now pressed heavily on the household. Attempts to contact the Reeds failed. Their rented cottage in Ravenford stood empty, with no sign of departure beyond a locked door and bare windows. The neighbors who once saw the couple regularly now realized they could not recall exactly when the Reeds had last been spotted. As the hours stretched and the silence grew heavier, the Averys took the only step left to them. They reported their daughter missing. The moment the complaint was filed, the absence shifted from personal fear to procedural concern, initiating an inquiry that would take investigators through a maze of incomplete records and misleading trails. Officers from the Ravenford Constabulary visited the Reed residence and found no furniture, no forwarding address, and no explanation for the sudden departure. The landlady stated that the couple had paid their rent in advance, but had left earlier than expected. No one in the surrounding areas had seen a child matching Rose's description. And at Marlow Bay, where the holiday was supposedly planned, no guest or staff member recalled seeing the Reeds. The first official 24 hours yielded nothing, and the second brought even fewer clues. Without witnesses, without registration records, and without modern tracking systems, the disappearance stood on uncertain ground. Investigators documented every detail available, but the picture did not sharpen. Instead, it grew wider and more troubling. Robert Avery spent those days sitting in the living room beside the phone, waiting for a call that never came, while Elaine searched through Rose's belongings, as if the missing pieces of the story might somehow be hidden in the folds of a small dress, or beneath the pillow where her daughter once slept. By the end of the second week, one fact was clear. Rose Avery had left Ravenford on the morning of the trip, and from that moment on, there were no verified sightings, no credible leads, and no confirmed destination. The town that had once felt predictable now faced an unsettling truth, and the Avery family was left with a silence that deepened by the hour and would soon stretch into years. And from that morning in 1969 onward, no one in Ravenford saw Rose Avery again. When the Avery family filed the missing child report on the evening of the 14th day, the atmosphere inside the Ravenford Constabulary shifted from routine duty to a more deliberate form of concern. Missing children were not common in that region, and when they did occur, the cases typically involved teenagers who returned within hours. A 4-year-old taken under the supervision of trusted adults created a situation that did not fit the patterns the officers were familiar with. The details were too unusual, too composed, and too quiet. For that reason, Inspector Arthur Collingwood, who had nearly 15 years of service and a reputation for methodical thinking, was assigned to lead the inquiry. His approach was steady, built around the belief that no detail was too small to revisit, and no assumption too sturdy to be left untested. Collingwood began with the last confirmed facts. Rose Avery had been seen entering the Reeds' car at approximately 8:30 in the morning on the day of departure. She was wearing a brown wool coat and holding a cloth rabbit. The vehicle had been observed heading north along the main road, though no resident recalled seeing it beyond the first intersection leaving Millstone Road. The Reeds themselves had provided no written itinerary, no lodgings booked in advance, and no traceable communication after the moment they left town. In Torrey, 1969, this absence of documentation did not immediately raise suspicion. Many families traveled without reservations or schedules. Yet in the context of a missing child, the lack of a paper trail became a void that swallowed every assumption investigators tried to build. One of the first steps Collingwood ordered was a door-to-door inquiry around Ravenford and along the northern route toward the Scottish border. Officers spoke with petrol station attendants, shopkeepers, and bus drivers, but none could provide a sighting that could be reliably confirmed. The car driven by Malcolm Reed was a common make and model for its time, and the faded blue paint could not be considered a unique identifier. The few who believed they had seen something were unsure of specific details, and without modern surveillance systems or license plate recognition, the search relied entirely on human memory. Collingwood recorded each statement carefully, even when they contradicted one another, knowing that threads often made sense only in hindsight. Back in Ravenford, inquiries into the Reed couple revealed a pattern that, while subtle, began to concern investigators. Malcolm and Charlotte had lived in several towns over the previous decade, never staying more than a few years in one place. Their employment records were inconsistent, with Malcolm taking odd jobs and Charlotte sometimes offering childcare services informally. None of these facts were inherently suspicious, but when assembled into a timeline, they suggested a couple accustomed to relocating without much notice. The landlady of their most recent cottage revealed that the Reeds had vacated the property a full week earlier than their rent agreement indicated. She added that they had left no forwarding address and removed all personal belongings swiftly, something she described as almost too efficient, as if they were ready before I even knew they were going. Parallel to the Reeds' background check, Collingwood examined the Avery family's history. He found no evidence of conflict, neglect, or financial pressure that might have encouraged the parents to relinquish custody. On the contrary, the family was described by neighbors as close and attentive, with the older siblings often seen guiding Rose home from the corner shop or helping her navigate the small playground behind the church. The Averys' panic in the days following Rose's disappearance struck every officer as genuine, and their cooperation with the police was complete. They provided photographs, details of Rose's habits, and any information that might be relevant. Elaine Avery struggled to speak without her voice trembling, while Robert answered every question with the same steady but strained tone. Nothing in their behavior suggested complicity or intent. Collingwood then followed the route toward Marlow Bay, the destination the Reeds had claimed. He contacted local constables, guest houses, and small inns scattered along the coastline. The descriptions of Rose and the Reeds were circulated, along with the make of the vehicle, but no staff member or traveler recalled seeing them. A few thought they recognized Charlotte's hairstyle or Malcolm's height, yet none could confirm it with certainty. Such vague recollections, common in investigations of that era, often created more confusion than clarity. With no receipts, no lodging entries, and no sightings, the theory that the Reeds had ever intended to travel to Marlow Bay weakened considerably. As the search expanded, Collingwood considered the possibility that the couple had crossed into Scotland, but again, the border at the time operated with minimal documentation for domestic travelers. British citizens could move freely without showing papers, and no system existed to monitor the movement of children. Without a passport requirement for travel within the United Kingdom, investigators could not determine whether Rose had ever entered or exited Scotland. They could only confirm that she had not entered any registered lodging under her own name or under an alias that matched the Reeds. The search grew more complex when investigators attempted to trace the couple's passport activity for potential travel abroad. Applications from previous years revealed incomplete addresses and discrepancies in birth dates for Malcolm and Charlotte, details that would raise immediate red flags today, but were difficult to act upon in the 60s. When officers contacted the passport office for further records, they learned that the Reeds' most recent documentation had been issued several years prior, and nothing since then indicated a renewal or amendment. From a legal standpoint, the lack of updated documents meant only that the couple had not traveled under their own names recently. It offered no insight into whether they had used forged or borrowed identities. While investigators worked through those dead ends, the Avery family's home became a gathering point for extended relatives and community members offering assistance. Flyers with Rose's photograph were circulated regionally, though printing capacities were limited and the image quality was often poor. Local newspapers ran brief articles summarizing the disappearance, but without dramatic developments. Public attention faded quickly. For a few weeks, residents in neighboring towns discussed the case with worry, especially parents of young children. Yet the absence of new information led the story to slip into the background of daily life. The Averys, however, did not have that luxury. Each evening, Robert returned home after speaking with officers, carrying with him the same heavy quiet that had settled into their household. Elaine often sat at the kitchen table long after the children went to bed, her hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. By the end of the 6th week, Inspector Collingwood delivered the first difficult assessment. No confirmed evidence placed the Reeds or Rose anywhere within the United Kingdom after the day of departure. The lack of sightings along the Marlow Bay route suggested that the couple had not traveled north at all. The empty cottage indicated a premeditated departure, though the extent of planning was unclear. The absence of documentation created an investigation without anchors, leaving Collingwood to describe the case as a disappearance without footprints. In his official summary, he noted that the child had been taken under the guise of a trip approved by her parents, which complicated the legal framing of the situation, especially in the early stages before the intent became evident. Despite the constabulary's continuing efforts, the investigation reached a point where every avenue circled back to the same unanswered question. Where had the Reeds gone after leaving Ravenford? Without that answer, the officers had no way to trace the path of the small girl whose life had shifted quietly from familiar safety into the unknown. And as winter approached, the case, though still active, began to lose the urgency of the early weeks, giving way to the steady reality that had begun to take hold. Rose Avery had vanished from the town that loved her, and in the absence of new information, the search would soon depend not on evidence, but on time. Time that the Averys endured minute by minute, and time that would eventually stretch far beyond the horizon any of them imagined. As winter settled over Ravenford and the days shortened into a muted succession of overcast afternoons, the search for Rose Avery entered a phase that the officers involved had quietly anticipated yet hoped to avoid. The immediate trails had dried. The early leads had either dissolved or proved unreliable, and the Reeds themselves had vanished so completely that they left behind no hint of direction. After nearly 3 months of continuous investigation, Inspector Collingwood assembled his team for a final review of the facts, not to close the file, but to acknowledge that no new path forward existed. The conclusion, though delivered with measured restraint, placed the case into a category no investigator wanted to assign: a missing child with no active leads, pending further information that might never come. For the Avery family, the shift was not marked by a single announcement, but by the slow quieting of activity around them. Officers stopped calling daily. The doorbell, once rung frequently by volunteers, relatives, neighbors, and well-meaning acquaintances, began to sound only when mail arrived. The newspapers, which had published Rose's photograph each week, stopped requesting updates when it became clear that no progress could be reported. The sense of urgency that had carried the community in the early weeks transformed into a gentler, more uncertain kind of sympathy, one expressed in soft remarks at the market or lingering glances from those who did not know what words could bring comfort. Life in the Avery household shifted into a pattern shaped by waiting. Robert continued to work at the metalworks plant, his movements more deliberate than before, as if he were conserving strength for something undefined. Elaine returned to her part-time work at the dress shop, though she often left early when memories unraveled her concentration. The older children, Thomas, Margaret, and Helen, learned too quickly how to navigate the silence that settled among them. They stopped asking whether Rose had been found, not out of lack of concern, but because they sensed the weight that question added to the air. In the evenings, when the supper table had one chair too many, the absence felt sharper than in the rush of daytime tasks. Elaine kept Rose's small room untouched, dusting it weekly and folding the little dresses in the wardrobe, as if preparing for a visit that could occur at any moment. The cloth rabbit, now worn at the seams, lay neatly beside her pillow, a silent reminder of the child who had once clutched it everywhere she went. Meanwhile, the case file, marked Avery Rose Missing Child, entered the storage archives of the Ravenford Constabulary. It was placed in the section reserved for unresolved investigations, where it joined a modest number of cases that preceded it and a handful that would follow. The file contained photographs, interview notes, maps of the region, and summaries of the Reeds' movements, though none of these documents offered answers. Collingwood requested that the case remain accessible for review, adding periodic updates whenever a new rumor surfaced or a distant sighting was reported. Though these instances were rare and often unverifiable, still he kept the habit of checking the file every few months, flipping through the pages not out of obligation, but from the quiet hope that a detail overlooked might reveal itself in a new light. Throughout the 70s, the Avery case surfaced occasionally when a child matching Rose's age and general features was reported in different parts of the country. In some cases, a family traveling through Yorkshire believed they had seen a girl who resembled her, though the timelines were inconsistent and none of the sightings could be substantiated. In other instances, rumors circulated of two adults traveling abroad with a child who appeared uncomfortable or withdrawn, but these stories lacked enough specificity to link them definitively to the Reeds. Travel records across Europe, limited as they were at the time, offered no trace of the couple, leaving investigators without the means to verify these potential leads. By the early 80s, changes in policing standards began to take place across the United Kingdom, including improvements in data management and interagency communication. Although these developments benefited many ongoing cases, they offered little assistance with a disappearance that had begun without digital records and without verifiable documentation. The Reeds remained figures who existed primarily in memory, descriptions captured only in aging statements from neighbors and a few blurred photographs taken at community events. Their ability to move undetected, once puzzling, now seemed more plausible when viewed through the lens of older investigative limitations. The Avery family's life moved forward in small, steady increments. Thomas enlisted in the military and eventually settled in Scotland. Margaret pursued work in healthcare, choosing a path shaped in part by her desire to support others through crisis. Helen married and built her own household in a nearby town, yet she visited her parents frequently, especially on dates that marked milestones. Each year, on the birthday that would have belonged to Rose, the family placed a single candle on the kitchen table. Sometimes they spoke openly about her, and sometimes they sat in reflective silence, not because their hope had vanished, but because the shape of it had changed. It no longer resembled the desperate anticipation of the early years, but a quieter, enduring belief that the story had not ended, even if they no longer knew where the next chapter might begin. The passing decades introduced new administrators, new officers, and eventually a reshuffling of old case files. When Collingwood retired, he left a note in the Avery file instructing that the case remain active for review should any new information arise. The note was thoughtful and brief, stating simply that absence cannot be presumed as conclusion. That phrase remained clipped to the inside cover and was occasionally read by younger officers who inherited the responsibility of reviewing cold cases, though none could find the missing piece needed to revive the investigation. Across those same years, the story of Rose's disappearance faded from local conversation. Younger residents of Ravenford heard fragments from parents or older neighbors, but did not know the details. What remained was a collective memory of a child taken during a time when trust was assumed and safeguards were limited. For the Averys, however, the memory did not fade. It lived in the corners of their home, in the items Elaine refused to discard, in the absence they had learned to carry as part of their daily lives. They understood that years could pass without change, but they also knew that time had a way of bringing hidden things to the surface when least expected. And so, as the 90s approached and the world entered a new era of technology, the case of Rose Avery rested quietly among the unresolved, held together by the hope of a family that refused to forget, and the lingering intuition of investigators who believed that even in the coldest cases, answers sometimes emerged long after the trail had disappeared. The question was not whether the truth existed, but when and through whom it would finally begin to show itself again. By the mid-90s, when much of the world had begun shifting toward digital records and interconnected databases, the case of Rose Avery remained anchored in a different era, preserved in a thin, carefully organized folder inside the Ravenford archives. It had been more than 25 years since her disappearance, and although time had pushed many events into distant memory, the details of that file still carried the same weight for those who had handled it in its early stages. Yet the decades had brought nothing resembling a lead. The Reeds remained untraceable, no record of their movements had surfaced, and the scattered rumors gathered over the years had never produced a verifiable thread. With no bodies, no witnesses, and no admissions, the case sat suspended, neither forgotten nor active, waiting for something to stir beneath the surface. That unexpected shift came not from Ravenford, nor from an investigator determined to revive an old puzzle, but from a place half a world away, where a woman named Claire Dawson stood at a government counter in Brisbane Hollow, filling out the paperwork required to apply for a passport. Claire was in her early 50s by then, a resident who had built a modest but steady life in Australia. She had raised children, worked various jobs, and participated in her community like anyone else. Throughout her adulthood, she had carried the name given to her by the couple who raised her, the Reeds. Assuming it reflected a past she simply did not remember. She had vague recollections of early childhood, brief flashes that never connected to form a coherent picture, but she accepted that some lives began with fewer details than others. What mattered to her was the present she understood. The application process, however, required documents she had never personally handled. Whenever identification had been needed in the past, Charlotte or Malcolm had taken responsibility for producing it, offering explanations that seemed sufficient at the time. She had never touched her original birth certificate, never seen an early medical record, and never questioned why so many forms from her early life looked too pristine, as if they had been created recently rather than decades before. When the clerk entered her information into the system, she expected the usual routine: a short wait, a confirmation, and perhaps a request to update a minor detail. Instead, the woman behind the desk paused, typed again, and frowned with a concentration that suggested more than a simple clerical error. She asked for another document, then another, and still nothing appeared in the registry. Claire's name did not exist in the database of births. Her stated place of birth did not match any recorded hospital entries. Her date of birth, one she had lived with her entire life, was unrecognized in the regional files. The clerk, speaking gently, suggested that Claire obtain an official copy of her birth certificate. That small request, seemingly routine, marked the beginning of the unraveling. Claire returned home unsettled but not yet alarmed. She asked Charlotte and Malcolm, but their responses were vague and evasive, as if they were reaching for explanations that had once been effective, but no longer held together under scrutiny. They blamed clerical loss, foreign travel, misplaced boxes, but their tone carried a strain that Claire had never noticed before. Her husband, Daniel, observed the tension and encouraged her to pursue the matter independently, assuring her that whatever the explanation was, clarity would bring peace of mind. With his support, Claire requested her birth records through several agencies. The answers came back consistently: no matching file, no archival entry, no registration. Her name and details existed only on the documents the Reeds had presented over the years, and those documents now appeared increasingly inconsistent under closer examination. Dates were misaligned, signatures differed, and certain stamps used on her earliest forms did not match the stamps used during the period they were supposedly issued. Each discovery chipped away at the foundation of the identity she had assumed without question. As she and Daniel compiled these inconsistencies, they noted how often the Reeds had moved during Claire's childhood, how frequently her school records indicated abrupt transfers, and how no early photographs existed except those taken after the age of 5. The absence of information became its own form of evidence. Claire began to search through public archives, looking for children reported missing during the late 60s, especially those whose ages aligned with her estimated birth year. It was during this slow and determined process that she found a small listing on a British database dedicated to long-term missing persons. The entry was brief: Rose Avery, missing from Ravenford, Yorkshire, 1969, age 4. There was a photograph, faded, slightly grainy, of a young girl with a round face, expressive eyes, and haircut just above the shoulders. Claire stared at it for a long time. Something in the shape of the jawline, the slight tilt of the head, and the solemn expression pulled at a memory she could not fully claim, and yet could not ignore. Over the next several weeks, Claire initiated correspondence with agencies in the United Kingdom, asking whether any additional information about the Avery case existed. The first responses were cautious and procedural, explaining that the case was decades old and that only certain files were available for public request. But when officials compared the details Claire provided with the missing child report, the similarities were striking enough to prompt further review. They noted the approximate year of birth, the lack of early documentation, the pattern of movement across countries, and the appearance that matched the aged-up projection created for Rose many years earlier. Although technology at the time of the disappearance was limited, investigators had attempted to sketch what Rose might look like as an adult. The resemblance to Claire was impossible to dismiss. With Claire's consent, the inquiry shifted toward a deeper examination of her early memories and any remaining items from her childhood. She found a few belongings: a small wool blanket, a photograph of herself at around 6 years old, and a notebook containing handwriting unlike her own. These items, fragile and worn, became valuable pieces in establishing the link between Claire Dawson and the long-lost child from Ravenford. Investigators also compared her recollections of early languages, accents she vaguely recognized, and the persistent feeling that her earliest memories did not match the story she had been told. The turning point came when a British official reviewing the old Avery case contacted the surviving siblings, Thomas, Margaret, and Helen. They had spent decades believing that nothing more would ever come of their sister's disappearance. When they learned that a woman in Australia had emerged with details aligning so closely with Rose's case, the information shook them with a mix of hope and disbelief. For more than 50 years, they had carried a question with no answer, and now, for the first time, a possibility appeared. Fragile, uncertain, but real enough to lift the silence that had surrounded their family for so long. What began as a simple passport application in Brisbane Hollow now touched a cold file in Ravenford, a family in Scotland, and an investigation frozen for half a lifetime. Something long buried had begun to move, and the truth, though still distant, was no longer out of reach. Gutly different angle, revealing features that the earlier photo had not emphasized. When that image was compared with Claire's childhood pictures, those taken around the age of 6 or 7 after the Reeds had already begun moving her across countries, the resemblance became unmistakable. The shape of the ears, the slight curve of the eyebrows, the narrow indentation above the left cheek. These were traits that rarely changed and could not be altered by memory. While the visual evidence strengthened, investigators sought additional ways to confirm the link. They reviewed immigration patterns, flight records from the late 60s, and any trace of travel involving Malcolm and Charlotte Reed. Although records from that period were sparse, a handwritten logbook from a small port in France contained a notation of a couple traveling with a child that matched the general description of the Reeds and Rose. The entry was brief, offering no names, but the timing corresponded with the weeks immediately following Rose's disappearance. That single line, faint and nearly forgotten, became one more piece in a puzzle that had waited half a century for resolution. For Claire, the confirmation process was both illuminating and disorienting. Each piece of information brought clarity, yet that clarity carried weight. She began to understand that her earliest memories, the scattered impressions of a different house, different voices, and a colder climate, were not imagined, but remnants of a life abruptly interrupted. She recalled asking Charlotte as a child why she did not have photographs from before a certain age, and being told that the family had lost them during a move. She remembered moments of confusion when hearing accents that felt familiar but could not place. These fragments, which she had always dismissed as the natural uncertainties of childhood, now formed part of a truth she was only beginning to grasp. Once the evidence reached a threshold that could not be ignored, British officials arranged a carefully structured conversation between Claire and the Avery siblings. The call was conducted with caution, guided by a liaison experienced in long-term missing person cases. When the screen connected, both sides sat in quiet stillness, each unsure how to begin. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice steady but filled with the deliberate pacing of someone choosing words with care. He did not ask Claire to confirm anything immediately. Instead, he described a memory from their childhood, a small routine from their home in Ravenford that had been mentioned in early witness statements. As he spoke, Claire felt a recognition that did not come from logic, but from something deeper. A sensation of having once belonged to a moment she could barely recall, yet somehow still carried within her. The conversation stretched over several hours, with pauses long enough to suggest reflection rather than discomfort. Margaret, the eldest sister, shared details about family traditions, small habits Rose once had, and the ordinary rhythms of their household. Helen, the youngest of the three, spoke more quietly, describing the years of wondering, the birthdays marked with a candle for a sister who had vanished, and the way the family kept her belongings untouched. Through each story, Claire recognized pieces of herself, questions she had never answered, impressions she had never understood. By the end of the call, she agreed to travel to Scotland to meet them in person, acknowledging that the final step toward clarity required more than documents or comparisons. It required presence. When Claire stepped off the flight at Edinburgh Airport several weeks later, the moment did not resemble the dramatic reunions often depicted on television. There were no crowds, no staged scenes, only 3 siblings standing quietly near a seating area, holding a worn envelope that contained the old photographs they had kept for 5 decades. For a time, they simply watched her approach, taking in the face of a woman who carried the traces of a child they had known so briefly, yet remembered so clearly. Claire walked toward them with a measured pace, aware that every step was closing a distance, measured not only in miles but in years. The recognition, when it came, was not theatrical. It was grounded in the kind of stillness that holds more truth than any spoken confirmation. Margaret stepped forward first, her hands trembling slightly, and touched Claire's face as if confirming a memory through gesture rather than sight. Thomas followed, grasping her shoulder with a steadiness that conveyed both relief and gravity. Helen stood nearest, tears gathering but not yet falling, repeating a quiet phrase that seemed to anchor the moment. "You came back." Claire did not respond immediately. She simply leaned into the circle of arms surrounding her, as if allowing the years of separation to settle into a shape she could finally hold. Over the next several days, the siblings talked for hours, filling the gaps left by time. They showed Claire the streets of Ravenford through old photographs and shared the traditions she had missed. Claire, in turn, recounted the pieces of her life she could recall, though much of her early childhood remained indistinct. The absence of memory was not treated as loss, but as part of the story that had shaped her life. For the Avery family, the confirmation of her identity did not erase the years of uncertainty, but it restored something they had believed was gone forever: the knowledge that their sister was alive. The truth, once elusive, had finally emerged, not through forensic breakthroughs nor through confessions, but through persistence, circumstance, and the quiet resilience of a woman who sought to understand her own history. The disappearance that had consumed Ravenford in 1969 now held an answer, and the child who had vanished without a trace had found her way back to the family who had waited an entire lifetime to see her return. In the weeks following the reunion, a question emerged that none of the siblings voiced directly at first, but all eventually confronted. What, if anything, could be done about the couple who had taken Rose more than 50 years earlier? For half a lifetime, Malcolm and Charlotte Reed had been the unseen center of a disappearance that disrupted an entire family. The siblings wondered whether investigators would pursue charges now that their sister had been located and identified. Claire herself, still adjusting to the weight of recovery and recognition, approached the question cautiously. She understood that answers might not come easily, yet she needed clarity as much for herself as for her family. Investigators in the United Kingdom reopened the legal file surrounding the Reeds, reviewing the statements collected in 1969, the follow-up reports from the 70s and 80s, and the information Claire had provided. What emerged was a complex picture shaped by the laws that existed at the time of the disappearance and the limitations of evidence remaining after decades. The central problem lay not in the severity of the act, taking a child under false pretenses, but in the way the departure had initially been framed. In 1969, Robert and Elaine Avery had given permission for their daughter to travel with the Reeds. There had been no indication, in those early moments, that the couple intended anything other than a short holiday. This initial consent, given in good faith, created a legal ambiguity that proved difficult to navigate even with modern standards. At the time, British law did not define the unauthorized retention of a child after a voluntary handover as clearly as it would later. Child abduction statutes existed, but they were applied more often in cases involving force, threats, or the removal of a child from legal guardians without any form of consent. By contrast, the Reed case began with parental cooperation, and the point at which the holiday became an act of abduction had never been documented. There was no letter, no witness, no single event that marked the moment the Reeds chose not to return Rose to her family. Without that clear point of transition, prosecutors lacked the foundation required to demonstrate criminal intent under the laws of the late 60s. The passing of time presented additional complications. Many potential witnesses had died or could not be located. The cottage landlord who had reported the Reeds' early departure in 1969 had passed years earlier. Travel officials who might have recorded the couple's movements were no longer available. Records from ports and border stations were incomplete, often handwritten, and sometimes destroyed during routine archiving. Most critically, neither Malcolm nor Charlotte Reed could be found. Their identities, fragile even in their original form, had likely been altered repeatedly over the years. Without locating them, any possibility of charges remained theoretical. Investigators also considered whether modern laws could be applied retroactively. Unfortunately, legal systems across the Commonwealth prohibit retroactive prosecution for acts that were not clearly criminal at the time they occurred. Even if the case were evaluated under today's standards, where parental abduction, identity concealment, and unauthorized international relocation of a minor are well-defined offenses, the crimes could not be legally attached to actions committed before those laws existed. Claire understood this element intuitively. The legal system, she realized, was not refusing justice, but operating within the limits of what the law allowed. The inquiry did reveal more about the Reeds. Through a search of international records, investigators located several fragments of data that likely pertained to the couple: an abandoned residence in France, passport applications under slightly altered names, and a series of temporary addresses in New Zealand during the 70s. Each of these records pointed toward a transient pattern of movement consistent with people attempting to avoid detection. Still, there was no conclusive evidence regarding their whereabouts after the mid-80s. They may have changed identities again, or one or both may have died. Without proof, authorities could neither confirm nor deny their current status. The question of accountability remained suspended. For the Avery family, the reality was sobering but understandable. They had lived long enough with uncertainty to recognize that some answers arrive incomplete. Thomas, now practical in his reflections, summarized the situation simply. The law could not be expected to reach backward into decades where structure and safeguards did not yet exist. Margaret expressed a belief that the truth, now known, carried its own form of resolution even without prosecution. Helen, who had been the youngest when Rose vanished, described a quiet shift inside herself. The disappearance had always felt like an unresolved wound, but the reunion and the confirmation of her sister's identity had turned that wound into a scar, something still visible but no longer open. For Claire, the legal conclusion was layered with complexity. She did not pursue revenge, nor did she express a desire for confrontation. Her interest lay instead in understanding the circumstances that shaped her early life. The revelations did not erase her gratitude for the good moments she experienced while growing up, but neither did they excuse the deception. She acknowledged that the Reeds had provided care, yet she understood now that the foundation of that care had been built on a choice that had taken her from the family she had been born into. In conversations with British officials, she asked practical questions rather than emotional ones. How her identity could be restored legally, how new documents would be issued, and whether she could reclaim the name she lost while retaining the one she had lived with. The officials guided her through each step, and for the first time in her life, Claire established legal records that reflected her true origins. While no trial would ever take place, the reopening of the case allowed investigators to construct a more comprehensive understanding of the disappearance. They concluded that the Reeds' actions aligned with patterns now recognized in cases of abduction by deception, a term used to describe situations in which trust is exploited to separate a child from their rightful guardians. Though the phrase did not exist in 1969, its application in retrospect offered a clearer vocabulary for what had occurred. Claire found some comfort in that language. It framed her early life not as a mystery without explanation, but as an incident grounded in identifiable behavior, shaped by circumstances beyond her control. The case was formally closed with a notation added to the file. Child located alive. Identity confirmed. Though the document did not list a perpetrator, its final line acknowledged the completeness of the outcome. The missing child, long presumed unreachable, had been found. And in the end, though no courtroom would weigh guilt or innocence, the truth itself had been restored. That restoration, imperfect but real, became the form of justice this case was able to hold. In the months that followed the official confirmation of Claire's identity, life settled into a quieter rhythm, marked not by sudden revelations, but by gradual adjustments. The Avery siblings, long accustomed to speaking of their sister in the past tense, now practiced using her name as part of the present again. They learned to incorporate Claire into their routines in ways that felt natural rather than ceremonial, inviting her into family conversations, gatherings, and decisions without the hesitancy that had shadowed their earliest interactions. For Claire, each visit to Scotland felt closer to a return than to an introduction, though she remained aware that she was balancing two histories, one lived and one lost. Her legal restoration progressed steadily. British authorities issued a new birth certificate in her original name, Rose Avery, while honoring her request to retain the name she had carried for most of her life, Claire Dawson, as an official alias. This dual recognition reflected the duality she now carried within herself. The child who had once belonged to Ravenford, and the woman shaped by years spent abroad. Claire spoke of the process with a calm acceptance, acknowledging that identity, once fractured, rarely snaps back into a single form. Instead, it settles into a shape that accommodates the experiences of both paths. In Ravenford, the confirmation of Rose's survival stirred memories among older residents who still recalled the disappearance. Some approached the Avery siblings with subdued relief, remarking that the story had lingered in their minds for years, resurfacing whenever they saw a child traveling with strangers or heard of a missing person in the news. Others had forgotten the details, but were reminded through regional reports that followed the reunion. The town, like many that carried unresolved histories, found a sense of closure in knowing that one of its mysteries had been resolved not through tragedy, but through discovery. The Avery home, unchanged in its foundation, carried new signs of life. A framed photograph of Claire taken during her first visit hung beside the older childhood images that had been preserved for decades. Elaine's small collection of Rose's belongings, kept untouched in a tin box long after her passing, was now held by Margaret, who showed it to Claire during one of her visits. Inside were the small wool blanket, a tiny beaded bracelet, and a pair of children's gloves. Claire examined each item carefully, not with the expectation that they would trigger memories, but with a quiet acknowledgement that they were fragments of a life interrupted. She did not force the connection. She simply allowed the objects to exist alongside. The truth she now understood. The emotional landscape of the family shifted gradually. Thomas found himself recalling stories from their childhood that he had not revisited in decades, and he shared them with Claire not to impose memories upon her, but to offer her a sense of belonging to a history she had been denied. Margaret, always the most practical, approached the reunion with a steadiness that Claire appreciated, providing her with family records, photographs, and names of distant relatives. Helen, the youngest, approached with a gentler touch, often sitting beside Claire in comfortable silence, understanding that connection is built as much through presence as through conversation. Claire's life in Australia also continued, though now it was enriched by the knowledge of her origins. Her children learned about their extended family abroad, and some of them expressed interest in visiting Scotland. Daniel, her husband, supported each step, recognizing that the journey was not about replacing one life with another, but about integrating truths that had been separated for too long. Claire spoke openly with him about the years she had spent under assumptions that now felt incomplete. She did not express resentment. Instead, she described a sense of realignment, as though her life had finally taken the shape it was always meant to have. The search for the Reeds did not revive. Investigators maintained the file, but accepted that the likelihood of locating Malcolm and Charlotte after so many years was minimal. Claire did not pursue that path further. She understood that accountability, while valuable, was not always attainable in the strictest legal sense. What mattered to her was the clarity she now possessed, the truth of her birth, her disappearance, and her rediscovery. In private moments, she reflected on the complexity of the Reeds' role in her life, recognizing that they had both shaped her upbringing and concealed its origin. Her feelings towards them remained layered, neither fully condemning nor forgiving, but grounded in a firm understanding of the choices they had made. As the first anniversary of her reunion approached, Claire traveled once more to Scotland. The siblings marked the date not with ceremony, but with a simple meal in Thomas's home, where photographs of both families now shared space on the mantel. They spoke of their parents, of the years that had passed, and of the quiet hope that had sustained them even in the absence of evidence. Toward the end of the evening, Helen placed the small beaded bracelet, the one Claire had worn as a child, on the table between them. It had been repaired once by Elaine many years earlier, and its colors had faded with time. Claire picked it up carefully, sensing that the object was less a relic and more a thread connecting every chapter of her story. In that moment, she made a choice that surprised even herself. She slipped the bracelet around her wrist, acknowledging that while she could not reclaim the childhood she had lost, she could carry a piece of it with her. The gesture was quiet, but it resonated deeply with the siblings, who understood that this simple act bridged the distance created by 50 years of separation. The Avery case, once a cold file gathering dust in a police archive, had reached a conclusion uncommon in long-term disappearances. A child taken under deception had been found alive, decades later, through persistence, circumstance, and a single request for documentation that had revealed a lifetime of hidden truths. The story did not erase the pain of the years spent wondering, nor did it rewrite the past, but it offered something rare. Resolution rooted not in finality, but in reconnection. In the closing note added to the official file, an investigator summarized the outcome in a single line. Located alive, identity confirmed, family reunited. It was a simple statement for a complex story, yet it captured the essence of what had been restored. And for Claire, for Rose, the journey had come full circle. She had returned not as the child who had vanished, but as the woman she had become, carrying both her histories with her. The search that began in 1969 ended not with the discovery of remains, nor the uncovering of a crime scene, but with a family embracing the person they had lost for half a century. The final story of the Avery case, though marked by absence, was ultimately defined by return. Before we close, I would like to hear from you. Where are you watching from tonight, and what thoughts or memories did this case bring to mind? Your reflections often guide the stories we tell next. If you found meaning in this reconstruction, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a comment, or sharing the video with someone who values thoughtful storytelling. Your support helps keep these long-forgotten cases alive and allows their voices, quiet as they may be, to be heard once more.